In part 1 of this video, I covered the issues I encountered bolting the UPR tubular chromoly K-member with spring perches into my 1993 2.3-liter Mustang Autocross car, including how custom motor mounts from 2.3 parts allowed me to attach the engine to the new K-member. This video details the problems I faced and the solutions I found while finishing the job, and reveals how much weight the UPR K-member with spring perches removed from Apocalypso. Putting the suspension and steering rack back into my little pony proved to be a challenge, starting with the OEM A-ARMS. My research revealed that I could have trouble getting the OEM A-ARMS with OEM bushings to fit into the UPR K-member. In fact, UPR mentions in their instructions that you might run into issues with the bushings when installing OEM A-ARMS with their K-member. The instructions that came with my K-member say you might have to press the bushings out, then press them in from the other side. The OEM bushings in my A-ARMS were in really bad shape, but I wanted to see if it was possible to get the OEM A-ARMS to fit with the bushings in the factory position. It took multiple attempts using lube, a C-clamp, a washer, and some angle iron to persuade the A-ARMS to go into the mounts. But eventually, I got both A-ARMS in. However, one of the old rubber bushings didn't survive the install. While preparing for this video, I found OEM A-ARM instructions on UPR's website. They call for grinding the knurled edges off of the OEM bushing sleeves to help with the install. The instructions also say to only tighten the A-ARM bolts enough to take up any slack between the K-member and the bushings. Do not over-tighten the bolts or torque them to factory specs. I can't say for sure that every OEM A-ARM and bushing combo will fit, and honestly, I don't think it's worth the struggle. Going slowly and battling the bushings, it took me 3 frustrating hours to get the A-ARMS in. And once they were in place, I found another issue. The A-ARMS made contact with the UPR K-member when rotated through their range of motion. The solution was to grind a little metal off of the end of the horns in order to get enough clearance between the A-ARMS and the K-member. So it is technically possible to get OEM A-ARMS with OEM rubber bushings to fit with the UPR K-member. But I suspect most people won't want to use OEM rubber bushings. So I yanked the A-ARMS out, drilled out the rubber bushings, and installed a set of poly bushings that I had taken out of my 1992 GT. I kept the metal bushing shells in the factory position to see if I could get this setup to fit. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the poly bushings into the K-member. And when the K-member sliced off a little piece of one poly bushing, I decided it was time for Plan B. Looking at the way the bushings lined up with the mounts, I felt the best solution would be to press the rear bushing shell flush up against the A-ARM. I called UPR and they agreed that was the best option. UPR was adamant that trimming the bushings and sleeves was not the right course of action. I tried to press the shells in with a bushing removal and installation tool, but I couldn't get them to budge, so I had to have the shells pressed in by Paul at FusionCraft. With the shells flush, the A-ARMS and poly bushings fit into the K-member perfectly. It only took about 5 minutes to get each A-ARM in place. Based on my experience, I think you should be prepared to have to press the bushing shells flush up against the A-ARMS in order to get poly A-ARM bushings to fit in the UPR K-member. I didn't want to disconnect the power steering lines, so I chose not to test fit the OEM steering rack on the UPR K-member before putting it in the car. When I tried to install the steering rack, I encountered 2 issues. One steering rack line hit the lower motor mount carriage bolt on the driver's side, and the steering rack body hit the UPR K-member's motor mount plate on the passenger side. The bolt interference was a simple fix. I just bought a new bolt and washer and installed them with the bolt head on the bottom. The solution for the steering rack body was a little more involved. Offset steering rack bushings wouldn't solve my problem. I contacted UPR and we determined the best solution was to grind the K-member. UPR told me this wouldn't impact the warranty. UPR also told me that it is rare to have to grind the K-member to fit the steering rack, but other people have had this issue. If you're installing a UPR K-member on your car, I recommend test fitting the steering rack prior to putting the K-member on the car. Working slowly and methodically using air die grinders with a burr and abrasive discs, it took 2 hours of removing material and test fitting to get 1/8 of an inch of clearance between the rack and the K-member. I'm not afraid of modifications, but it was a little unsettling to have to cut into a brand new K-member. With the grinding done, I used the poly bushings and hardware that came with the UPR K-member to finish installing the steering rack. It took me 30 minutes to get the steering rack bolted in. When it was time to install the springs, I decided to use a set of Eibach Pro Kit springs that I had from a previous project with new poly spring isolators. I swapped the OEM rubber dust shields into the Eibach springs. In all transparency, these won't be the springs I end up using when I autocross Apocalypso, and I'll be happy to get them off of the car because I really had to fight to get them in. The Eibach springs are the same length as the OEM springs. They were too long for me to be able to use the Maximum Motorsports spring installation tool, which worked really well on my 1992 GT. I had to use an internal spring compressor that ended up getting stuck in the tighter top coils. I needed to use a pry bar, hammer, and drift to knock the internal spring compressor out, which scratched up the springs. I've installed a lot of springs in a lot of Mustangs over the years, and this was the toughest, most frustrating process I've ever experienced. I ended up using the Maximum Motorsports tool as a backup after the internal spring compressor was removed to make the job a little safer. But even with a floor jack supporting the A-arm and a chain around the spring, this install was pretty sketchy. The spring could have come flying out at any point when I was right next to it, which is why I didn't stop to take pictures. I think the install would have gone much smoother using the internal spring compressor on the OEM springs or linear rate lowering springs. A plate-style spring compressor might also have worked better. Because I struggled to get the Eibach springs in and the spring compressor out, it took 3 hours to get the springs installed. When I installed the OEM sway bar, I used the OEM end links, but I put on a set of slightly used poly bushings, because the end link bushings that were on the car were in bad shape. I tightened the end links with the suspension under load, making sure I had an even number of threads showing through the nuts on both sides of the car. Thankfully, the sway bar end links went in without any problems in about 10 minutes. Keep in mind that you will need an alignment after installing the K-member. Because I'm still tearing into Apocalypso, I didn't get the car aligned, but I did drive around the block a few times and everything seems to fit and function properly. My plan was to install the UPR K-member over one weekend, but because of all of the issues, the install happened slowly over the course of several weeks. With all of the test fitting, grinding, pressing, and trying different A-arm bushings, it took me 20 hours and 10 minutes to get the K-member installed. But it's worth noting that many people have had an easier time with the install than I did. I had pretty much every problem a person could have, but every problem had a solution, and I'm glad I get to share those solutions. After all of that work, how much weight did I actually remove? The OEM K-member weighs 47.8 pounds. The UPR K-member and spring perches weigh 22.44 pounds. Installing the UPR K-member and spring perches took 25.36 pounds out of Zone 1. So far, I've taken 96.47 pounds out of Zone 1, 82.59 pounds out of Zone 2, and 96.66 pounds out of Zone 3. That adds up to a total of 275.7 pounds out of Apocalypso. My first lightweight K-member install was more chaotic than I would have liked, but I had an incredibly positive experience with 2.3 parts, and I was pleased with UPR's customer service too. But I do think UPR could do a better job of providing detailed instructions. I'm really happy to be over halfway to my goal of getting 500 pounds out of Apocalypso, but I still have a long way to go. I'll cover more weight reduction mods in the next video in this series.